Okay, it's recording. Whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Shmuel, and thank you, Iggrot Ta'ari. It's nice to be with you. It would be nicer to be with you in Morningside Heights, but perhaps sometime in the near future. As Shmuel mentioned, I'm Jeff Saks, and I occupy all of these different roles in Jewish life and learning. But I have been based these many years here in Israel. But I maintain close connections with those of you back in New York and the greater Jewish world. So I hope that our paths will be able to cross in the real world. Shmuel did mention WebYeshiva, and I really do invite you to visit WebYeshiva.org, which is a fully interactive online yeshiva with a whole variety of courses and classes around the clock from all over the world. You know, many of the best teachers from Israel and elsewhere. We were around before everyone discovered Zoom with Corona. So we had a bit of a head start. And I am the editor-in-chief of the journal Tradition. Among my goals when I became editor last year of this very storied journal that's been around since 1958 was to really try to draw in new readers, younger and younger writers. And to whatever degree Iggrot Ta'ari can be the farm team for Tradition. We'd be happy to coordinate with you. But I invite you all to visit the website of traditiononline.org or to find us on Facebook and give us a like, even though Facebook is for your parents. Young people don't do Facebook anymore, I'm told. But to follow us at Tradition, people that are really interested in what's going on in the larger intellectual world of American and worldwide modern orthodoxy. Some of the topics we'll be talking about today really should be following what we're doing at Tradition. We have a new student rate subscription, either for digital only access or for the print journal. There are still people who read the thing on a pieces of dead tree bound together that show up in your mailbox 4 times a year. And it really is quite worthwhile. Our most recent issue contains a really interesting symposium that was guest edited by Molly Brofsky. Perhaps some of you studied with her at MMY. A symposium on Jewish thought in the contemporary world, educational challenges and goals. So I put up in the chat box both my email. I'd be happy to get any feedback or questions or comments or observations about what we'll be talking about tonight, as well as the link to Tradition. Before we get into our conversation about emotion versus intellect as educational challenges in Rabbi Soloveitchik's thought, I just cannot meet with you today and not make mention of Rabbi Jonathan Saks, Zichrono Livracha, just a tremendous loss to all of us. Based upon what I know of your own interests in Jewish learning and thinking, I'm sure that you're all familiar with Rabbi Saks's important contributions to our endeavor. And it will be a long time, and perhaps not in our lifetime, before we see the likes of him again. I should mention that Rabbi Saks's very first piece of published scholarship was an essay called Alienation and Faith, which was published in Tradition in 1973. And he was 25 years old, which means he probably wrote the essay when he was 24 years old. That's not much older than you. You might even be, your age. At the age of 24, 25, he writes a lengthy essay. I think it's about 28, 29 pages long. You can find it in our archives on traditiononline.org by searching for his name. It's a response to another essay we had published, a little essay that had come out about 7 or 8 years earlier called The Lonely Man of Faith. When Rabbi Soloveitchik's Lonely Man of Faith, which you all know now as a book, a small book-length publication, was originally published in the pages of Tradition. And young Rabbi Jonathan Saks, he may not yet have even been ordained at that point, I'm not sure, wrote a response and actually a critique of Lonely Man of Faith. It took a young man of a lot of self-confidence to do that, to take on the Rav in 1973 when the Rav was still very much at the height of his powers. And it's an essay that really has withstood the test of time to read Rabbi Saks's engagement with Rabbi Soloveitchik's Lonely Man of Faith. So I mentioned that and I commend it to your attention, and we all bow our head in mourning for the loss yesterday of Rabbi Jonathan Saks. I should add, asterisk, of no relation to me. I once joked him when I met him years ago, he asked, "Are we related?" And I said, "No, you spell your name wrong." So, but we're here to talk about Rabbi Soloveitchik, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik. I assume we don't need to go into the lengthy biographical sidebar to talk about Rabbi Soloveitchik. I assume that we're familiar with his work, but if you're not, there are many wonderful ways to catch up on that, including a recorded lecture that you can find on YU Torah, in which I talk about an introduction to his life and thought. Searching for that on YU Torah, you will find it. Of course, I would recommend the book by my friend Rabbi Reuven Ziegler, Majesty and Humility, which is the best one-volume overview, a survey of Rabbi Soloveitchik's philosophy. Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about biography and how it intersects with thought, how it intersects with philosophy. We're going to focus on one particular episode in his biography that took place in 1959 and in the early years of 1960. And that was this well-known encounter that he had with the chief rabbinate. He was considered to be a candidate for the newly open position of chief rabbi of the state of Israel. Rav Herzog passed away in the summer of 1959. Rav Herzog, Isaac Halevi Herzog, was the chief rabbi. He inherited the job from Rav Kook, who passed away in 1935, and he became the chief rabbi, the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Palestine. And then de facto, he became the chief rabbi of the state of Israel. One morning, he woke up as the chief rabbi of Palestine. That day happened to be the 5th of Iyar, 1948. And that evening, he went to sleep as the chief rabbi of the state of Israel. So the state of Israel kind of inherited him from the British mandate. When he died in 1959, the state had never elected a chief rabbi. There was no clear mechanism and there was no clear consensus on how to go about doing that. And there were very serious debates about how the election should take place. It happens that every time the position is vacated, now there are term limits. In those days, it was an appointment for life. Now there are term limits, but every time the position comes open and there are elections, there's all types of monkey business about exactly what is it's not popularly elected, of course, but what is the well, to borrow an expression that must be on your minds this week, what's the electoral college? What's the body, the group of electors that's going to choose the next chief rabbi? It's usually some kind of combination of members of Knesset, rabbis that are members of the council of the chief rabbinate, mayors of large cities. It's this interesting electoral college. That's my term for it. This interesting gufa bocher, this electoral college that selects the chief rabbi. But how you understand how you put together this puzzle of electors is going to shift favor towards one candidate over another. And of course, in our days, struggles between more right-wing or more Haredi candidates and more liberal, more religious Zionist candidates, these are part of the politics that get into the play. When Rav Herzog passes away in the summer of 1959, there were a variety of names tossed about as potential candidates to replace him. One of them was Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, who was then really in the prime of his powers. He was 56 years old. He had, established the Maimonides School in Boston. Perhaps some of you are Bostonites, I'm not sure. He had, served as the chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of Greater Boston, and of course he had been the Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva University already for 2.5 decades since the passing of his father. He was the unrivaled figure standing astride the modern Orthodox community in the United States. Even though modern Orthodoxy was not a term that was used in those days, it was not a term that he ever uses, not even once in his published writings. But today, the community that we call modern Orthodoxy, he was the undisputed figure and authority. And his name was being bandied about as chief rabbi. The Rav had only once ever visited the land of Israel. In 1935, he was a very young man. He was 32. He was candidate to become chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. At that point, he had only been in the United States for a few years, and he had not really yet found himself. And when the chief rabbinate of the city of Tel Aviv became open, he flirted with it. He made a long visit over the summer of 1935 to Tel Aviv to, well, frankly, it's a campaign for the job, and he was not elected. And that defeat kind of stuck with him for years. It kind of gave him a, well, maybe even a thin skin about politics. In a well-known address, which is today published in a work called The Rav Speaks, 5 addresses, this collection of speeches that he delivered over the period of years to the Mizrahi, the religious Zionists of America in the United States, of which he was the honorary president. He acknowledged that his association with Zionism did not come naturally. I should point out, as an incentive to people to subscribe to tradition, in our next issue, which should be out at the beginning of January, in our next issue, we'll be publishing a transcript of the talk that the Rav gave at the Mizrahi Convention in June 1948, 1 month after the establishment of the state. He spoke about the meaning of Jewish sovereignty. It was a lecture that he gave in Yiddish. The manuscript had been unknown or lost or tucked away all these 70 plus years, and it's recently been discovered and translated to English, and it'll be published in the next volume of Tradition. So that's something to look out for. And he would give these speeches at the Mizrahi. And these, he was a very famous orator. He could hold a crowd of hundreds of people in his hand for hours at a time, whether in his native Yiddish. These talks were all delivered in Yiddish and later published in Hebrew and in English, or whether in his adopted language of English or even in Hebrew. He was considered to be the greatest orator of his day. And he told the audience, "I was not born into a Zionist household. My parents' ancestors, my father's house, my teachers and colleagues were far from the Mizrahi religious Zionists. They too held, 'Why meddle in the secrets of the merciful one?' the kind of slogan of the anti-Zionist or non-Zionist position that who are we to meddle in how God is running the world? If I now identify with the Mizrahi against my family tradition, it is only because I feel that divine providence ruled like Yosef against his brothers." In a larger drasha, the drasha is an explication of the story of biblical Joseph and his brothers, and why the brothers could not tolerate Yosef. Now, you don't need to be Sigmund Freud to figure out that if he's talking about the biblical Yosef, who was not always understood and appreciated, he might be talking about himself, Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. And he describes how the biblical Yosef and his brothers, here the brothers are the anti-Zionists, and Yosef is the one who can kind of see things. Yosef is the one who, when cast down to Egypt, he kind of knows how to get things done. He knows how to save all of the people. The idea that those that are left behind are on the verge of death, and it's Yosef that can coordinate their salvation. Well, perhaps that's saying something about Zionism's role in the rescue of the She'erit HaPleita, of the remnant of the Holocaust. He says in that earlier in the drasha, that's what it means. The brothers, Yosef goes looking for the brothers who've gone to Dotan to shepherd the flock, and there's Viaret Yosef Mirachok. They see him coming from afar. And he says, that's the problem. They only see Yosef from afar. When you're looking from a distance, you can't appreciate the complexities of the person. You can't understand his point of view. V'yard Yosef mirachok, only from the distance. That's, part of the problem of contemporary, both in the country in which I'm sitting, the country in which you're sitting, the problem of the political chasms between different opposing camps. We only see each other from a distance. We can't really enter the other person's point of view. He says, I feel that divine providence ruled like Yosef against the non-Zionists, that he, God, employs secular Jews as instruments to bring to fruition his great plans regarding the land of Israel. Now, of course, here he's channeling whose position? You're able to open your microphones, right? There's not so many of us. He's channeling Rav Kook. Rav Kook against the mainstream right-wing ultra-Orthodox position. Rav Kook saw something very positive in the secular pioneers, the Chalutzim, who were building Eretz Yisrael, even though they were eating the velot and treifot on Yom Kippurim. Nevertheless, he thought that they were doing God's work. They were partnering with the building of the land. And the Rav here is channeling Rav Kook. In that 1935 visit to Eretz Yisrael, the Rav met Rav Kook. Rav Kook was then on his deathbed. He passed away in September of 1935. The Rav was there in June, July. And he went to go visit Rav Kook. And there was a very interesting meeting. I once wrote about this in Tradition. You can find it on our website. Enough for the paid advertisements. I also believe there would be no place for Torah in Israel today were it not for the Mizrahi. I built an altar upon which I sacrificed sleepless nights, doubts, and reservations. Regardless, the years of the Hitlerian Holocaust, the establishment of the State of Israel, and the accomplishments of the Mizrahi land of Israel convinced me of the correctness of our movement's path. I came from a tradition, my family tradition, the Soloveitchiks, his father Rav Moshe, his grandfather Reb Chaim, his great-grandfather Rav Yoshaber, the Beis Halevi. These were not Zionists. They were at best neutral to Zionism and perhaps even antithetical to it. Perhaps they were opponents to it. Because I came around to appreciate Zionism. Now, this was necessary because, as a candidate for chief rabbi of the State of Israel in 1959, it wasn't really possible for him to, seriously consider or seriously be considered, without a kind of statement of his Zionist bona fides. His uncle, the Brisker Rav of Jerusalem, the Rav's father was Rav Moshe, and his uncle was Rav Velvel, or Yitzchak Zev. In Yiddish, he was known as Rav Velvel Soloveitchik. The Brisker Rav was, kind of like the center of gravity in the Haredi world in Jerusalem in those days. He was, of course, not a card-carrying Zionist. He passed away on Yom Kippur, 1959, right at the height of the Rav's flirtation with the chief rabbinate. And sometime later that year, not during the Shloshim, it was in December, the Rav gave a hesped, a eulogy for his uncle, the Brisker Rav. That eulogy has been published in Hebrew for a variety of reasons. It has never been translated to English. It may be one of the most important. Actually, tonight we're going to see sections from the two most significant works of Rabbi Soloveitchik, which have not yet been translated into English. One is his eulogy for his uncle, which was published in Hebrew under the title Ma Dodech Medod. It's a verse in Shir Shirim, which, as a play on words, can mean, well, literally it means what is more beloved than my beloved, but of course the word dod also means uncle. So it's what is more beloved than uncle. It's a very interesting eulogy. The Rav was not only just a very famous orator, he was a very famous eulogizer. He would use eulogies as a kind of window into a whole personality type, the same way that in all of his great writings, he portrays kind of distilled personalities. the Halachic Man, the cognitive man, the Homo religiosus, the lonely man of faith, the majestic man, Adam 1, the covenantal man, Adam 2, these kinds of pure distilled archetypes. So he would often do that in the context of eulogizing someone. He would explain why this person was this type of person. And if you understand what that ideal archetype is, you'll understand something about the dearly departed. For Reb Velvel, for his uncle, he didn't need to invent a new character. He had a stock character. He just had to call down to central casting and have them send him up. That was, after all, Halachic Man. In 1945, the Rav had published his monumental essay, Halachic Man, Ish Halacha, which he explicitly says is probably a description just of his father, his uncle, and his grandfather. So in the eulogy for his uncle, he revisits this character of Halachic Man. In many ways, to understand Halachic Man, you have to revisit those sections of the eulogy for Reb Velvel, because it's a kind of later, 15 years later, he goes back and kind of adds an addendum to Halachic Man by way of describing explicitly his uncle. Well, there's a problem, because his uncle, after all, was not a Zionist. And here's the Rav. He's a candidate, or he's flirting with the idea of becoming a candidate chief rabbi of the state of Israel. And he acknowledges the fact that his uncle was not a Zionist. He says they said of him, of Reb Velvel, that he was opposed to the state of Israel. This is not correct. Opposition to a state emanates from adopting a position regarding a political body, which is itself a political act. My uncle was completely removed from all socio-political thought or response. What may be said of him is that the state found no place within his halachic thought system, nor in his halachic value scale. He was unable to translate the idea of a sovereign secular state to halachic properties and values. It's not that he was an anti-Zionist. It's just that Zionism didn't exist for him. After all, you remember, you may have read the Ish Halacha, this kind of portrait of how the Ish Halacha views the world through the a priori lens of the Halacha. The most very famous passages, he sees a bubbling spring, but he doesn't see a phenomena of nature. He sees it with the superimposed on it are Hilchot Mikvaot. Is this or ain't it a mikvah? Is there or is there not arba'im sa, a sufficient quantity of water so that that which is immersed in the spring exits purified? He sees the sunset, that most famous passage. His father takes him out into the synagogue courtyard late in the afternoon, Yom Kippur, and the sun is reddening over the trees in the west. He says, you see that sunset? Well, it has nothing to do with the aesthetics of it. It has to do with slicha, mechila, kapara, because this sunset is different than the sunset the other 363 days of the year. Because with this sunset, a halachic reality is affected. And that is the passage of the day, the Itzumu Shel Yom Kippur, and with it comes atonement. So Reb Velvel, the halachic man, these are my words, not his, halachic man kind of like sees the world through like these halachic spectacles, or like a radar, a radar, it's looking to see if anything's entered our airspace. So, in the Air Force or in the Army, when they have the radar, they're looking to see if maybe an enemy plane has entered. But all types of things enter our airspace all the time. Birds, right? Birds enter the airspace all the time. We can't stop them. Birds don't know anything about, migrating birds don't know anything at all about national borders. So we don't want the radar to pick up if every time a bird flew in, it registered on the radar, there'd be so many false positives that the radar would be ineffective. So the radar has to be tuned to identify an airplane or a missile, and not even very large birds. So that's the halachic radar with which halachic man sees the world. There are halachic realities which he sees, and then there are things which are just completely off the map. They just completely don't register on the halachic radar. One of them is a secular state. There's no siman in the Shulchan Aruch to tell us what's the din of a secular state. So it's not that my uncle was opposed to the state, but as Ish Halacha, it's like it didn't exist. He was unaware of its existence. There were people that said that what the Rav says here is nothing but, kind of bald apologetics. Shmuel, are you raising your hand?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I don't find this I mean, it's kind of in the vein of what you were saying at the end with apologetics. Like you have people like Yeshayahu Leibowitz who the idea of the halacha is like so ingrained in the secular state nowadays. Like there's so many issues that we have to incorporate into it. So I don't find it like super convincing that he just didn't like see its existence as like. I mean, I guess at that point it was different because you're right. There is no simon in the Shulchan Aruch.
I think that it could be that the people that thought that the Rav was softening this may have been correct.
Mm-hmm.
There's no doubt that Velvel was what we today would call an anti-Zionist.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And the Rav is kind of trying to finesse it a little bit here.
Mm-hmm.
Says this fact, the fact that the state was a secular entity, the fact that the state, we couldn't attach it to a particular sif in the Shulchan Aruch, led to disappointment. This disappointment led to my uncle separating himself from the most important event in modern Jewish history, meaning the establishment of the state. In other words, the Rav is saying, look, my uncle was who he was. And because of his positions, he could not appreciate the state of Israel. Either it didn't exist for him, or he didn't appreciate it, or he ignored it, or he opposed it. But because of that, it caused him to overlook the most important event in modern Jewish history. But I, his nephew, Joseph B., I can appreciate the most important event in modern Jewish history. I can appreciate the establishment of the state of Israel. The Israeli consul general to New York was in the audience on the night that the Rav gave this lecture, and immediately cables back to Jerusalem. Here's the man to be the next chief rabbi. He was being talked about, and because in those days it wasn't like today, they couldn't all meet on Zoom. The distance between Jerusalem and New York was much greater than it is today. It's even when I came on Aliyah 25 years ago, it was much, much greater. Who knew about what was going on? The kind of transference of ideas. Forget the fact that, what many or most of you did, which was to spend a year or two studying here, and the kind of cross-pollination between the communities, it just didn't exist. So the Yediot Achronot newspaper sent a young reporter by the name of Eliezer Wiesel. We know him as Eli Wiesel, Zichrono Livracha, the great advocate for peace and for memory of the Holocaust. But at that time, he was a young 30-something reporter for Yediot Achronot. He was the foreign correspondent for Yediot in the United States. And he's sent to go interview Rabbi Soloveitchik to write a profile of him, which appeared in the weekend newspaper, the weekend magazine profile of Rabbi Soloveitchik. And this is part of the interview. Wiesel asks him, well, the Rav had been talking about the accomplishments of what Orthodoxy had done in the United States, some of which he could take credit for, although certainly not all. To us, I'm a little bit older than you, but we're all still on this side of the historical divide. In the 20s, 30s, 50s, 40s, 50s, it was unimaginable, with all the problems that Orthodoxy faces today worldwide. The colossal success of our religious community was unimaginable. There were sociologists who thought that in a generation or two, there would be no Orthodoxy in America, perhaps outside of a small pocket on the Lower East Side. They couldn't imagine, how the Lower East Side would be, or Williamsburg, right? Like places that today are the center of Hipsterville. Those would be the last ghettos of Orthodox Jewry. But that Orthodoxy, synagogues around the United States were tearing their mechitzot down. If you look at old issues of tradition, going through the archives of tradition is a very fascinating time capsule to see what was interesting, what were the issues that people were dealing with. Look at issues from the late 50s, early 60s. You'll see a lot of talk about mechitza, right? Something which we don't, it's not an issue today. We discuss what's the most egalitarian way to create a mechitza. What's the way to make a holy space in a synagogue where both genders feel welcome and involved. But nobody's debating the existence of mechitza within the Orthodox world today. In other places, it's still debated. At least certainly for the main prayer. But Orthodox synagogues were tearing down mechitzot and going conservative or reform left and right. So the Rav says we've achieved a lot. We've accomplished a lot. We have, and here he's talking both about Maimonides and about Yeshiva University. He says, we have young boys who are studying law and studying engineering and studying physics, and they also, learn a daf Gemara. The idea that you could have what we take as given, what all of you are or will become, what your parents are, frum balabatim, which had been unimaginable just a few years before. He says we're turning the corner. So Wiesel asks him, and what about Aliyah to Israel for these youths? Will these people that you're so proud of, you think they're going to come on Aliyah? The Rav said, it's a dream. A nice, of course, the article is published in Hebrew. This is my translation. A nice dream, but I doubt if it will ever happen. The youth and Jews in general are no longer drawn towards Israel as they once were. They take interest in it. They do anything on its behalf, but they will not settle there. Why? In the past few years, there's been a change in the attitude of the American Jew towards Israel. For example, I recall that when I was a young boy in Chaslovich in Europe, the land of Israel was for me a deep inner experience and not a mere geographic, political, or even religious concept. When I would hear the name Eretz Yisrael, every bone in my body would tremble. Today, Israel has become a concept which does not draw on the depths of the soul or the longings of all generations. Today, the term Israel has lost the messianism in it. The article, which touched on a whole variety of things and was published over a few pages in the Weekend magazine on November 13th, 1959, the headline was Aliyat Noar Me'artz Brit Bebchinat Chalom. Aliyah of the youth of America is a dream, which of course in Hebrew can also mean it's a fantasy. It's a pipe dream, right? It'll never happen. Says Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, mentioned as a candidate for Chief Rabbi of Israel. Wiesel did not necessarily write the headline. The editors are usually responsible for writing the headlines. But by framing this larger conversation around this one topic, the Rav says that Aliyah is dead. You can forget about it. No young American is coming on Aliyah. This was scandalous at a time when, this is before Nefesh B'Nefesh. This is a time when the idea of Aliyah was the reason for the existence of the state of Israel. The state of Israel is 11 years old at this point. It's not even bar mitzvah yet, not even bat mitzvah yet. Medina is feminine. It's not even bat mitzvah yet, right? And the idea that American Jewry is not going to come on Aliyah was scandalous. Of course, the Rav was right. American Jewry did not come on Aliyah in masses, certainly not in the 50s. There was a bump after the Six-Day War, and more or less, even with Nefesh B'Nefesh, it's remained rather flat over the years. But this was scandalous. How could he say such a thing, that American Jewry, the Jewry for which he is the leader, they're not going to come on Aliyah? There was a newspaper that was published for many decades in the United States called Hadoar. It was published by the Histadrut HaIvrit BaAmerica, the Hebrew Association of America. It was a Hebrew newspaper published in the United States. It was a newspaper, then it became a monthly magazine, then it became a newsletter, then it became a quarterly newsletter, and then it went out of business. And the decline of this newspaper, which was once, like people read the Yiddish Foverts and people read it was once a very important platform for the Jewish community, not only the Orthodox community in the United States, when you had a population of people that were going to be reading a Hebrew newspaper. Many of the Rav's short essays, which were later collected in book form, were originally published in Hador. After Wiesel publishes this profile, the editor of Hador, somebody named Moshe Meisels, writes a very scathing critique of the Rav for what was reported in his name. The article in Hador was published right before the Rav made those comments at the eulogy for his uncle. It's possible that what he's saying about Zionism and anti-Zionism is a response to all of that machloket around what was reported in his name. The Rav clearly wanted to respond to this harsh critique that was published in Hador, but that very night, in December of 1959, that he delivered this barn burner, stem winding eulogy for his uncle, he told his family that he'd been diagnosed with colon cancer, that he was going back to Boston in the morning for surgery, and who knows what will be. Nobody should want colon cancer. Not today, not ever. But in 1959, colon cancer was a very, very serious thing. Today it's an extremely serious thing. Then it was a super duper extremely serious thing. He was 56 years old at a time when life expectancy was not what it is today. And he probably, for the first time in his life, was facing death. His daughter, Tova, was engaged to the young Aaron Lichtenstein. They postponed their wedding, which had been scheduled for a week or so later, a few weeks later. They postponed their wedding so that the Rav would be able to participate. Of course, in those days, serious abdominal surgery meant you were laid up recuperating for sometimes weeks and weeks and months at a time. It's not like today. It was the only extended period of absence that the Rav had from public life and from his classroom. And that encounter with, looking death in the eye, of course, he was completely healed from the cancer, but it left a profound impact on his thought. In his collection Out of the Whirlwind, his collection of essays on suffering, he writes, "The night preceding my operation, I prayed to God and beseeched him to spare me. I did not ask too much. All I wanted was that he should make it possible for me to attend my daughter's wedding, which was postponed on account of my illness. A very modest wish in comparison with my insane claims to life prior to my sickness. However, this fall from the heights of an illusory immortality into the valley of finitude was the greatest achievement of the long hours of anxiety and uncertainty. When one's perspective is shifted from the illusion of eternity to the reality of temporality, one finds peace of mind and relief from other worries. When one frees himself from this obsession, his perspective becomes coherent and his suffering bearable. He learns to take defeat courageously." Through the months of his recuperation from December until March of 1960, there was ongoing discussion about maybe he would still run for chief rabbi. He discovers that he's not being offered the job. He's being invited to run for the job. And it wasn't clear to him that he could win. Moshe Chaim Shapiro, who was a member of Knesset, who was the head of the Mafdal, the party that no longer exists, the party that morphed into what today is Yamina, the party of Naftali Bennett, but then was the Miflagad Datit Leumit, the National Religious Party, was headed by somebody named Moshe Chaim Shapiro, who had been a childhood friend of the Rav's in Europe. He was an ardent supporter of the Rav, but he could not guarantee that the whole party would support him. Ben-Gurion, who was then prime minister, favored the young Shlomo Goren. Rav Goren was the chief rabbi of the army. Later he would famously, storm into the old city with the paratroopers after the Six-Day War with shofar and Sefer Torah in hand. And later in the 1980s, he would be elected chief rabbi of the state in his own right. Others favor the candidacy of Rav Unterman, who ultimately was elected. But in the meantime, there was no clear decision on how the election was going to take place. And the Rav understood that he didn't necessarily have the support of all of the people he would need in order to mount a serious campaign. And he writes a letter in February, about 6 weeks after the surgery, to Shapiro that says, "By nature, I'm a teacher, moreu melamed. I know nothing of administering offices. I flee from ceremony, presentations in the press, and especially from politics. I had initially hoped to separate the spiritual ideas of this position and its technical and political needs. I had hoped that I could dedicate my time and energy to spreading Torah and knowledge of God, and I was ready to answer the call for such a position. However, developments in the situation and political complications in the recent past about the electoral process convinced me otherwise. Under such circumstances, I do not see myself as a fit and proper candidate to be appointed to such a great position." Later, he says, to be chief rabbi means you have to be the teacher of Torah in chief. But if the whole thing is really just a political mechanism, and if politics are going to interfere in the workings of the chief rabbinate, so then what are you chief of? If you can't be chief of Talmud Torah, then there's no value in being chief rabbi. He goes on to describe his grandfather, Reb Chaim, and he tells a story of Reb Chaim, of his utter simplicity. The great Reb Chaim Brisker, whose Torah we still drink to this day. There's a story that Reb Chaim comes to the courtyard of the shul, and he sees a little boy crying. He says, "Why are you crying?" So they were playing some game where one kid would be the donkey, and the other kids would ride on him. So this little kid, they made him be the donkey, and all the other kids were piling on top of him, and it made him sad that the other kids were picking on him. And Reb Chaim said, "How can a little boy like you be a donkey? Right? You need to be much bigger to be a donkey." And he, Reb Chaim, gets down on all fours in the synagogue courtyard, and all the kids pile on top of him, and he giddy ups around the courtyard. So Rav says that's what it means to be a rabbi. That's what it means to be a rabbi, to carry the yinglach, to carry the little children on your back, to not stand on ceremony, right? But to be betoch ha'am. That's how you teach people. That's how you inspire people. That's how you... In an interview that he gives to the Yiddish newspaper, the Tag Morgen Journal, in March, they ask him, "Okay, look, Rabbi, you're not interested in the job. But after the job is what the job is. It's no surprise, right? It's not like we didn't know what being chief rabbi of the state was. So why did you consider it so seriously, given that, the job description is what it is?" So he says, "First, I thought I would avoid the institutionalization and remain myself. I would be me and not the chief of rabbis. Second, in my great naivete, I dreamed of being able to democratize the rabbinate in Israel by freeing it from politics and the ministry of religion. Third, and this was the main attraction, was the potential for teaching and disseminating Torah. This is the point I mentioned a moment ago. I dreamed that as chief rabbi, I would be able to transform the rabbinate into a font of Torah and knowledge. I thought that I would be able to deliver shiurim like I do in New York. The chief rabbi must be the leading teacher of Torah. And otherwise, in what way is he chief?" That proposal was directed again. He talks about there were proposals. They were going to pass laws to say that in order to be a candidate, you have to first have made aliyah, which would have disqualified him. Then Ben-Gurion wanted to pass a law, an age limit that you had to be under 70, which would have ruled out Rav Unterman. In other words, they were going to, as they say in Hebrew, litfortik. They were going to gerrymander the description of who could be a candidate, so that basically, it would have been only the one person that they wanted. So he says, it proved to me the holy institution is nothing more than a ball for the political parties to play with. And then having, declared that he wasn't going to be a candidate, and having recovered from his bout with cancer, in March, he returned to YU. While he was gone, his younger brother, Aaron Soloveitchik, had filled in for him, and that was the beginning of his association with Yeshiva University. Those of you, if there are any Chicagoans amongst you. And there was a reception at YU to welcome the Rav back, at which he announced, all of this talk about me going away, it's not going to happen. I now recommit myself to our work here together in the United States, in Boston, in New York. And the only thing that really was left over, although it would be 2 more years before Israel got around to electing someone, in this case, again, Rav Unterman, because they realized the thing was dragging out so long and there was no chief rabbi, they realized that if we don't elect someone soon, people are going to get the idea that maybe we don't need a chief rabbi. So the only thing that really was left was that critical article that had been published in Hador. The Rav very much wanted to respond to that. And he did in an essay called, this is the second most important essay of the Rav's that has never been translated. In Hebrew, it's called Al Ahavat Torah V'Gulat Nefesh Hador, on the love of Torah and redemption of the generation's soul. Rabbi Lichtenstein said it's the very best introduction to the Rav's thought, the very best essay of the Rav's, which gives you an overview of his own thought, and that might be because it's written from such a very personal place. He describes this attack on him and his response. He says that the problem is that, how it is with the newspapers. They take you out of context. They only report part of what you said. When Elie Wiesel, when this young reporter asked me about what's happening with the state of the young Orthodox in the United States, I said to him, and here's the quote, "I am troubled by 3 negative phenomena which prevent full realization of the dream. First, the dream being a solid, committed Orthodox community in the United States where we can really feel there's stability and the promise of continuity. First, the percentage of youths learning in yeshivot is very small. By yeshivot here, he means it's what we call day schools, right? Even though it's increasing every year, it's not yet sufficient to calm our worries. Number one, the most important ingredient to the future of the Jewish community in the United States is Jewish education, is Jewish day schools, that Jewish children have to be in Jewish day schools. Second, we have not yet succeeded in America to produce true Gedolei Torah, of whom we may be proud. On the third point, of which I spoke at length, only a fraction was reported. That's the problem with the press. Once you have to say, I was taken out of context, you've lost. I inadvertently touched upon a serious educational philosophical problem which has long troubled me. Orthodox youth have discovered the Torah through scholastic forms of thought, intellectual contact, cold logic. Yes, we've made great strides. People study Torah. However, they've not merited to discover the Torah through a living, heart-pounding, invigorating sense of perception. They know the Torah is an idea, but do not directly encounter her as a reality perceptible to taste, sight, touch. Because many of them lack this Torah perception, their hashkafa of Judaism becomes distorted. In one word, they are confounded on the pathways of Judaism. And this perplexity is the result of unsophisticated perspectives and experiences. Halacha is two-sided. The first is intellectual, but ultimately it is experiential. Shmuel, you're raising your hand. If anybody else wants to speak, just open your microphones. I can only see a few of you at a time. Go ahead.
This is just a clarification. When he says orthodoxy, he's talking specifically about what we would call modern orthodoxy, correct?
I believe so. I think he's talking about the community which he led.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, ultra-Orthodoxy in the United States at this point was not what we think of. Lakewood existed. It was kind of this little remote enclave down in New Jersey, and there were, Chassidim in Brooklyn and other places, but the world did not look then the way it looks today. And also the borders were far more porous than they are today. You understand this long path I've taken you down to get to the topic of intellect and emotion that we've gotten here. So he says that was the problem. That we've made great success. We've made great strides in intellectual development, in terms of learning, in terms of education, but yet we have not fully succeeded on the emotional plane, on the experiential plane. And that has left us with a population that's somehow disabled. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, the Rav's son-in-law, points to this as a central element, something that bothered the Rav incessantly. In a memorial for the Rav, which is published in Rav Aaron's volume called Leaves of Faith, he writes, the frustration centered primarily on the sense that the full thrust of the Rav's total effort was often not sufficiently apprehended or appreciated, that by some parts of his Torah were being digested and disseminated, but other essential ingredients were being relatively disregarded, if not distorted. He often felt that even among Talmidim, some of his primary spiritual concerns were not so much rejected as ignored. Indeed, that spirituality itself was being neglected. The tension between the subjective and the objective, between action, thought, and experience was a major lifelong concern. The sense that he was only partially successful in imparting this concern gnawed at him. And that's why people's connection to Eretz Yisrael is not complete, because it emanates from the intellectual. You know, a few years after this, there's the 6-Day War. And people really thought it was going to be the second Holocaust. They thought the whole experiment of a Jewish state was going to go up in smoke. Miraculously, it wasn't. The Jewish community feels a deep connection to the land of Israel. Even, many of the Jews about whom he was talking had never visited Israel. In those days, it wasn't like today. The idea of study abroad, the idea of vacations, the idea of coming for Pesach, the idea of coming for summer tours, it just didn't exist, besides the expense and the distance. But nevertheless, people felt an intellectual connection to the state of Israel. But because overall, the Orthodoxy in America was not yet emotionally mature, they were lacking that connection. And the essential connection between the Jew and Eretz Yisrael is an emotional connection. Elie Wiesel did not understand this point, or his ability to communicate it on the pages of a newspaper, which automatically kind of makes everything more shallow, did not get full expression. And the Rav says, that's why I was misunderstood in the newspaper. Because this is the emotional challenge. This is the experiential challenge that still faces us, despite all of the successes that I'll give on our midterm report of where modern Orthodoxy is mid-century. We still have a way to go on the intellectual side, on the emotional side. The Rav goes on to say in that essay, Alavat Torah Nefesh Ador, I affirm that I can identify the one responsible for the present situation, and that is none other than myself. I have not fulfilled my obligation as a guide in Israel. I seem to have lacked the ability, the personal power required of a teacher in Rav, or perhaps I lacked some of the desire to fill the role completely. I did not devote myself completely to the task. To a greater or lesser degree, as an educator and teacher on the plane of Gadlut HaMochin, these are Kabbalistic terms which he kind of repurposes to mean intellectual achievement and emotional development. Mental greatness, on the plane of mental greatness, my students have received much Torah learning from me, and their intellectual standing has strengthened and increased during the years they have spent with me. But I have not seen much growth on the experiential plane. I have not succeeded in living in common with them, cleaving to them, bestowing some of my personal warmth on them. My words, it would seem, have not kindled a divine spark in sensitive hearts. The failing lies with me. Rav Aaron observed in that essay, this too is part of the Rav's legacy, the candid recognition of failure transcended by its very acknowledgement. In his own personal vein, so aristocratic and yet so democratic, he has imbued us with a sense of both the frailty of majesty and the majesty of frailty. Only Rabbi Lichtenstein could have come up with a phrase like that. So for the Rav, this was the challenge, right? The two sides of Jewish life, emotion and intellect. I don't know where we are today. It's so many years later. We're 60 plus years after that. When finally, even though throughout the ongoing negotiations to find a chief rabbi, the Rav's name was continued coming up. He was always a little bit sheepish about the whole thing. They would say, well, maybe you want to reconsider, and he would say, I will not be a candidate for chief rabbi at this time. And he would always hold out a little straw for people to cling to. But ultimately he didn't. It's a fascinating question, kind of like the historian's parlor game of the parallel history, the parallel universe. What would have happened if the Rav had come in Aliyah in 1960? As if we assume that that his lifespan would have unfolded in the same way, in which, unfortunately he became ill towards the end of his life. But that was only in the mid 1980s. The job then was a lifetime tenure. He would have been chief rabbi for another quarter century. What would have happened? Well, first of all, what would have happened to American Orthodoxy if he had exited the stage at that point? Who would have taken his place? Would someone have taken his place? How would Orthodoxy have developed? How would it would it have gone to the right? Would it have gone to the left? Would it be exactly the same as it is today? Because after all, despite our love affair with the great man theory of history, the train barrels down the track, and things have a way of kind of moving along despite the many significant contributions of any one man or woman. On the other hand, what would his influence in Israel have been? Israeli Zionism, particularly because of the colossal impact and influence of Rav Kook and Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook and the school of Zionism that was founded around those thinkers, put great emphasis on discussing the collective, put great emphasis on discussing Klal Yisrael. The Rav always focused on the individual. The Rav rarely spoke about national things. He was more, the Rav actually rarely spoke about God. He was more interested in the religious individual, in the lonely man of faith, in the halachic man, in the homo religiosus, the religious man or woman. He's almost more of a religious anthropologist than a theologian. He wants to know what the religious experience is for the individual. And in almost every case, he's filtering it through his own biography. He says when it comes to talking about religion, egotism is true humility. Why? Because at best, I can only ever understand my own experience. And even then, I'm not sure that I fully understand my own experience. So to be able to talk about myself, that's why The Lonely Man of Faith, his most significant work, is a purely autobiographical statement. And he says, maybe what I'm describing here won't resonate with you. I don't know, maybe perhaps those of you that studied the essay in high school or studied it if you came to yeshiva in Israel, maybe you read The Lonely Man of Faith and it opened your eyes like it did for so many people. Maybe you read it and it just didn't resonate with you. Maybe you construct your religious experience. You understand the things that went into making up your religious outlook in a completely different manner. He says that's completely legitimate. I can only describe to you my own experience. He is the lonely man of faith. He's not even the halachic man. He does not completely identify with this character of halachic man. That could be a topic of a different conversation, maybe one day. Why the Rav does not identify with halachic man. But among the reasons he doesn't identify with halachic man, germane to our conversation, is because he saw greater room for the place of emotion in religious life than halachic man does. He thought the expression of emotion, he looks at the modern state of Israel and says, I don't know, the halachic man doesn't register on his radar, but for me, I see it's the most significant event in modern Jewish history. And it takes an emotional openness to be aware of what that means. Right? And he says, that's how I can identify as a Zionist, because I connect into it through my emotional, my experiential and emotional side, not through my intellectual side, not through my Litvish side, not through my Halachic Man side. Right? And that's what made him such an interesting perspective. But that's how he created his so interesting perspective on Jewish life, which has of course gone on to inspire so many of us in different ways until this day. That's why the Rav's writings and teachings and Torah are still so worthy of our attention these many years after his passing, after his leaving the public stage. So these are some thoughts on emotional and intellect in the Rav's thought. I thank you for joining us. I commend your good work to keep Jewish thinking and Jewish learning and Jewish life something that's vibrant in Colombia. And if we can be of help to you, we're happy to do so.